A message from your scribe!
Democracy is one of humanity's most significant and, at the same time, one of the most controversial achievements. This system of governance appears to be a lonely island among other political systems. Democracy, after all, embodies the idea of equality and citizen participation in power. While many cultures and civilizations throughout history have developed various forms of citizen participation in the affairs of the state, ancient Greek civilization is almost universally regarded as the cradle of democracy. But is it really? Does Athenian democracy truly should hold this title? Or is it merely the best documented stage in the development of older system of governance? Perhaps democratic ideas are deeply rooted in the essence of humanity itself and have been with us since the earliest times. Ludwig Wittgenstein in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus stated, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." The philosopher this way encouraged learning of foreign languages, so following his advice, let's take a look at Greek-derived term democracy. This concept consists of two words, demos and kratos, which respectively mean people and rule. So we can literally translate our term as the rule of the people. This may seem quite obvious, but I mention it not only as a historical reminder, but also to introduce an interesting derivation of this term. Ancient Greek philosophers coined two other terms in their works, one of which shares half of its name with democracy. I'm referring to ochlocracy, which means the rule of the mob. Among Greek thinkers, including Aristotle, there were concerns about entrusting power to the whole population. They advised limiting the authority of the population to the selection of their representatives. The basis of a democratic state is liberty, which, according to the common opinion of men, can only be enjoyed in such a state. This they affirm to be the great end of every democracy. One principle of liberty is for all to rule and be ruled in turn. And indeed, democratic justice is the application of numerical, not proportionate equality. Every citizen, it is said, must have equality, and therefore in a democracy the poor have more power than the rich, because there are more of them, and the will of the majority is supreme. As the rule of the mob, Aristotle and other Greek philosophers essentially acknowledge the democratic rule of the poorer social classes which, despite their strong legitimacy in power, will always lead the nation towards downfall. Aristotle also points out the widespread distribution of resources, supported by the will of the majority, but also highlights the potential instability of this system due to vulnerability of the mob to radicalization and external influences. In contrast to ochlocracy or democracy, which are based on emotions, the philosopher proposes a system called politeia, where neither the working class nor high-ranking oligarchs do not have much to say. In the vision of this system, the political activity of moderately wealthy citizens leads society to balanced development due to the absence of excessive ambitions, which are automatically constrained by the system, limiting the ability to rule by oligarchs. Moderately wealthy citizens govern the country based on proven skills in acquiring and managing wealth, along with political wisdom. Why am I talking about all of this? Because democracy can take on many faces, and whether we label a given system as democratic, let's not fool ourselves, depends on our subjective point of view. One such perspective is published annually by the British magazine The Economist. Their democracy index is perhaps the most popular, but that doesn't mean it's the most accurate. And it's unlikely to change, because democracy as a term suffers from a chronic lack of precise definition. Let's agree that so-called rule of the people is not a very extensive explanation of the nuanced system of governance we observe in almost all countries around the world. The word itself conveys only the idea of the rule of the people, and it's incredibly flexible as a result. This gives those in power a mandate to bend the established rules to their own interest, but that's not all. We gain the right to seek at least a glimpse of democracy even in the shadows of history. The history of Mesopotamia, which we will discuss, largely tells us about megalomaniacal kings who lived for hundreds of years and their kingdoms that emerged and disappeared. However, within the academic community there is a group of researchers who claim that traces of democracy, not yet called by that name, can be found in Mesopotamia. Evidence must, of course, be sought in written records, so let's take a look at the myths of ancient Mesopotamia, namely the Babylonian epic of Enuma Elish. All the great gods, ordainers of destinies, came before Anshar. They were full of joy. One kissed the other in the assembly of the gods. They conversed, sat down at a feast. On produce of the field they fed, imbibed of the wine. They gorged their systems with pudding. They felt good from drinking the beer. Utterly carefree, their spirits soared. they ordained the destiny of Marduk, their champion. We encounter a rather veiled description of the functioning of the assembly of the gods here. This assembly consisted of 50 gods and goddesses, each with an equal vote, regardless of gender. The council of rulers of the universe was typically convened when the gods needed to make a decision. During these meetings, some would present their arguments, while others listened. Then it was a time for discussion and deliberation on the pros and cons of each issue or proposal. After deliberations and when the consensus was reached and the council achieved full agreement, the 7 elders, led by the god Anu himself, would announce the decision, which was then ratified by all the gods with the words, "Let it be." At that point, the will of the assembly became divine law. This is how the gods chose Marduk to face the powerful sea goddess Tiamat. By the way, I hope you won't accuse me of spoiling a story from several thousand years ago, but Marduk emerged victorious in this battle, and from the body of slain goddess, the earth and the heavens were created. Stories like the Babylonian myth of Enuma Elish or the Sumerian lament for are meant to function as allegorical forms illustrating the human world through divine. Literally, these images of deliberating gods present us with political machinations in the accessible form of religious myth or legend, but they are based on real democratic sentiments and ideas of social egalitarianism. Myths, while being just myths, have some basis in reality, so some scholars have assumed that if Mesopotamian scribes described divine council meetings in this way, they must have experienced similar assemblies in the cities of Mesopotamia. This is how the concept of primitive democracy was born. If you think that this is a bit of far-reaching conclusion, you are correct. Some of the academic community examining this issue, especially figures like Thorkild Jacobsen, did not receive widespread approval. Nevertheless, let's take a look at the arguments put forth by the Danish Assyriologist. According to Jacobsen, primitive democracy functioned similarly to the divine assembly mentioned earlier. Social gatherings were organized to make decisions on a wide range of issues, from administration, public trials, construction projects, and trade missions to matters related to irrigation. Above all, the assembly was to convene in the face of external threats. In such situations, the Council of Elders, symbolizing the older gods, but likely represented physically by the ruling class, would approve the will of the people, who played the role of lesser deities. Some scholars suggest that these assemblies resembled a divine congress also because both men and women collectively participated in decision-making. During the assembly, every citizen had the right to express their opinion, and the discussion continued until unanimity was reached. The final decisions were then announced by the elders. However, here we encounter 2 problems. First, the elders. The existence of this group of individuals, likely the best educated or simply the most influential, who, according to Jacobsen, serve as a kind of upper house of the parliament, may actually indicate that in Mesopotamian cities we are not dealing with democracy but with oligarchy, a government system that is, by the way, very well known in Greece. Secondly, the king. Although the presence of a king does not make the existence of democracy impossible, as is quite vividly confirmed by the existence of contemporary democratic countries where, theoretically, crowned heads hold power. In any case, one of the crowned heads of Mesopotamia, although only being a semi-legendary literary figure, gives us hope to believe that the foundations of a collective governance did indeed develop long before anyone said the word democracy. I'm of course referring to Gilgamesh, the ruler of Uruk. At his gates arrived envoys from the city of Kish, the local hegemon at the time, led by the king Agga. The messengers of the king of Kish delivered an ultimatum. Uruk must surrender, or else the enemy will turn it to rubble. Despite being a king, Gilgamesh, instead of leading an army independently, consults with his people, and the descriptions of these assemblies is already quite familiar to us. First, he goes to a conservative council of elders, who seem to be representatives of more influential families. They advise Gilgamesh against fighting the army of King Agga. At that point, Gilgamesh decides to look for advice from ordinary peoples of the city. Gilgamesh presented the issue again, this time before the able-bodied men of his city. Never before have you submitted to the house of Kish. Should you not smite it with weapons? In the convened assembly, his city able-bodied men answered Gilgamesh, standing on duty and sitting in attendance, escorting the king's son, and forever grasping the donkey's reins. Who has that much breath, as the saying goes? You old men should not submit to the house of Kish. Should we young men not smite it with weapons? When Agga comes, what terror he will experience. That army is small and scattered at the rear. Its men will be incapable of confronting us. If we can indeed consider what took place during the Divine Council or on the main square of the city of Uruk as a form of direct democracy, or even a semblance of it, it's worth pondering one question: why were these traditions not continued? There might be some reasons behind that. Firstly, the scale. Taking the well-documented history of Greece as an example, we see that direct democracy is only possible in small city-states. Once the city-states in Mesopotamia began transforming into small kingdoms with populations scattered across multiple urban centers, the quick organization of gatherings became impossible. Secondly, the water. Properly constructed irrigation systems that watered the fields were to the Mesopotamians what oil deposits are to Americans. Increasing conflicts over resources forced the need for a strong military leadership. Commanders became rulers and their sons became kings. Democracy was slowly to evolve into a monarchy, leaving traces only in literature. But is it really the case? There are still few examples in Mesopotamia where we can look for at least hints for more nuanced system than a simple monarchy. In the well-known to us city of Kish, the population rebelling against the ruler of Akkadian Empire, Naram-Sin, conducted general elections to appoint their king around 24th century BC. We know him only by the name he assumed after coming to power. Ibhur Kish can be translated literally as one who assembled Kish. Around the same time, the people of the city of Lagash rebelled against their king. The power were leading the rulers toward megalomania, which, by the way, shortly led to the city's downfall, as Lagash was later conquered by the Akkadian Empire. According to this story, the city's authorities had completely stripped the citizens of all rights, both economic and social, as well as political. There was no agreement on this, both from the influential temple elite and the commoners. The citizens of the city sided with the temple, rejecting the terror and despotism imposed by the rulers. Whether there was a conflict or if the king was peacefully overthrown is not mentioned in the sources, but it's on one of these tablets that we find the documented word freedom for the first time. Why do I mention this? Well, because democratic systems are sometimes described as those where the overthrow of power does not require armed revolution. Evidence of certain forms of democratic governance reaches us from other places in Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions. In the city of Ebla, the king was said to be appointed for a maximum of 2 7-year terms, after which he would even receive a pension. Assyrian trading companies operating in Anatolia also made decisions based on agreements reached in assemblies. A similar state of affairs was said to exist in the political life of Phoenicia, where the city of Byblos was also meant to be based on the will of the popular assembly. Many of these traditions of collective decision-making grew out of earlier practices. Leadership, whether collective or individual, was rooted in small communities scattered across the Near East long before the emergence of concentrated populations and more complex societies. Individual leadership, which eventually triumphed, took on various forms, and what we call today kingship was merely a term for much more complex systems that did not always rest on autocratic foundations. This was due to people's strong bond with tribal tradition and a time when, to put it simply, politics had not yet been invented. Some forms of collective leadership and tribalism, finally Jacobsen's primitive democracy, have existed since the dawn of the human history, sometimes independently, sometimes as a complement to individual rule. But can we call these systems true democracy? If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Thanks.